You ever notice how the hardest seasons of life are usually the ones where you're trying to force something, a relationship, a breakthrough, respect, money, validation, and the more pressure you apply, the more resistance you feel? That tension you carry in your chest isn't ambition, it's misalignment, and most people ignore it until life humbles them hard enough to listen. Let me be clear about what this message is and what it isn't. This is not about sitting back, waiting, or being passive. This is not about avoiding work or responsibility. This is about learning the discipline to move with purpose instead of panic, to act with faith instead of fear, to understand that not everything meant for you needs to be chased. Some things need to be prepared for. If you want clarity, stability, and long-term progress, you need to stop forcing outcomes and start aligning with direction. Here are 5 principles that separate people who build lasting lives from people who burn out chasing short-term wins. Most people don't realize they're forcing life until they're exhausted, frustrated, and quietly resentful of the very things they once prayed for. Forcing rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up subtly, disguised as effort, ambition, or urgency. It sounds like telling yourself you're just hungry or driven, when in reality you're afraid of being left behind, afraid of not being chosen, afraid that if you loosen your grip even slightly, everything you care about will slip away. That fear becomes the engine behind your decisions, and once fear is driving, logic slowly moves to the passenger seat. When you force outcomes, you stop asking honest questions. You don't ask whether something fits your long-term direction. You ask whether it can work right now. You don't ask whether a person aligns with your values. You ask whether they can fill a void. You don't ask whether an opportunity is sustainable. You ask whether it relieves today's pressure. The choice feels justified in the moment because it reduces discomfort, but the trade-off is almost always delayed and more expensive. You gain temporary relief at the cost of future stability. And because the cost doesn't show up immediately, the pattern repeats. This is how people end up in relationships that drain them, jobs that hollow them out, and lifestyles that look productive from the outside but feel chaotic on the inside. They weren't lazy. They weren't stupid. They were simply reacting instead of aligning. They were solving for anxiety instead of direction. Forcing is what happens when insecurity convinces you that speed matters more than accuracy. But in real life, accuracy compounds, and speed without direction just increases the distance from where you should be. Watch how this plays out in everyday behavior. Someone who isn't secure in their value talks too much, explains too much, proves too much. They push conversations, chase validation, and overextend themselves just to feel chosen. The short-term outcome is attention. The long-term outcome is exhaustion and imbalance. The other person unconsciously senses the pressure and pulls back, not because they're cruel, but because healthy systems resist force. Respect doesn't grow under pressure, it grows under consistency and self-control. The same logic applies to work and ambition. People who don't trust their long-term ability try to compress results. They cut corners, jump too early, or say yes to things they aren't ready for because they fear missing their window. The choice buys the momentum. The trade-off is fragility. When challenges appear, they always do. The foundation can't support the weight. What looked like progress reveals itself as premature exposure. The outcome isn't failure alone. It's a loss of confidence that takes even longer to rebuild. Forcing is also closely tied to divided focus. When your priorities aren't clear, everything feels urgent. You chase multiple outcomes at once, hoping one will stick. Your energy spreads thin, your attention fractures, and nothing receives the depth it requires to grow. From the outside, it looks like activity. From the inside, it feels like noise. Long-term results don't come from doing more. They come from doing fewer things with greater discipline. But discipline requires the uncomfortable acceptance that you can't have everything now, and insecurity hates that truth. There's a quiet intelligence and restraint that most people underestimate. When you don't force, you create space to observe. You notice patterns instead of reacting to emotions. You see how people behave when you're not chasing them. You see how opportunities unfold when you're prepared rather than desperate. This doesn't mean you stop working. It means your work is no longer fueled by panic. You move with intention instead of impulse, which dramatically improves the quality of your decisions. Consider the person who waits to speak until they understand, instead of rushing to be heard. They may appear slower in the moment, but over time their words carry more weight. Or the person who delays a major move until they've built enough skill and leverage. They might feel behind temporarily, but When they step forward, they stay forward. These outcomes aren't accidental. They're the result of understanding opportunity cost, the idea that every yes is also a no to something else. When you force a yes too early, you often say no to a better version of the same thing later. Misplaced focus quietly destroys outcomes because attention is a finite resource. When it's spent on chasing validation, fixing unstable situations, or managing self-inflicted chaos, it's unavailable for growth. This is why people who force often feel busy but stagnant. Their energy is consumed by maintenance, not progress. They're constantly putting out fires instead of building structures. Over time, this creates a subtle bitterness. They feel like they've worked hard, yet nothing feels solid. The truth is, effort applied without alignment doesn't accumulate, it leaks. The uncomfortable part is accepting responsibility for this pattern. It's easier to blame circumstances, timing, or other people. But forcing is a choice, even when it feels automatic. It's choosing immediate relief over long-term clarity. It's choosing motion over direction. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often silence would have served you better than explanation, how often patience would have produced more than pressure, how often waiting would have saved you from unnecessary loss. Letting go of force requires trust in your preparation, trust in time, trust that what's meant to grow doesn't need to be wrestled into existence. That trust doesn't come from blind optimism. It comes from disciplined self-investment. When you're consistently improving your skills, managing your habits, and honoring your values, you don't feel the same urgency to grab at outcomes. You know you're becoming someone who can attract and sustain better ones. That inner stability changes how you move. You still want more, but you're no longer willing to sacrifice yourself to get it. This shift doesn't make life effortless. It makes it cleaner. Fewer regrets, fewer entanglements, fewer situations you have to escape later. You become more selective, not because you think you're better than others, but because you understand the cost of misalignment. You understand that every forced decision is a tax on your future focus, and you start protecting that focus with the same seriousness you once protected your ego. In the end, not forcing anything isn't about passivity or spirituality detached from reality. It's a practical strategy rooted in cause and effect. Calm choices lead to stable outcomes. Rushed choices lead to fragile ones. Focused effort compounds. Divided attention decays. When you stop forcing, you're not giving up control. You're applying it where it actually matters, on your discipline, your direction, and the kind of life you're building one quiet decision at a time. Most people assume that if something is meant for them, it should feel smooth. They believe alignment looks like open doors, quick wins, and constant reassurance. So when resistance appears, delays, tension, repeated obstacles, they interpret it as failure or bad luck and respond by pushing harder. What they rarely stop to consider is that resistance is not always rejection. Sometimes it is information. Sometimes it is instruction. And sometimes it is the only honest signal telling you that the direction you're moving in will cost more than you're prepared to pay. Human behavior under pressure follows a predictable pattern. When things don't work easily, emotion rises and reasoning shrinks. The mind starts negotiating with reality instead of listening to it. You tell yourself that persistence means ignoring discomfort, that strength means pushing through every barrier, that quitting is weakness. But there is a difference between endurance and blindness. Endurance is staying committed to a sound direction despite difficulty. Blindness is staying committed to an unsound direction because your ego refuses to adjust. Resistance becomes dangerous when it is consistent and character eroding. When every step forward requires you to compromise values, overextend resources, or silence your intuition, the cost is not just external, it is internal. You trade clarity for momentum. You trade peace for progress. And at first that trade feels acceptable because you're still moving. But movement alone is not proof of progress. A person can move quickly in the wrong direction and only realize it when turning back becomes expensive. Look at how this shows up in everyday life. Someone stays in a job that constantly drains them, not because it is challenging in a healthy way, but because it demands constant emotional labor with little growth. Each day requires them to tolerate disrespect, suppress their judgment, or abandon long-term development for short-term security. The choice is justified as responsibility. The trade-off is slow decay. Over time, their confidence weakens, their skills stagnate, and their identity narrows. The outcome is not just burnout. It is a quiet loss of self-trust that makes future decisions even harder. The same pattern appears in relationships. When connection is aligned, effort still exists, but it doesn't feel like self-erasure. When resistance is a warning, every interaction feels heavy. You rehearse conversations. You explain yourself repeatedly. You lower standards to keep peace. You call it compromise, but it is actually imbalance. The immediate outcome is temporary closeness. The long-term outcome is resentment and confusion. When people ignore this form of resistance, they don't just lose time, they lose emotional precision. They start confusing attachment with compatibility, intensity with depth. Resistance that guides rather than blocks usually has a specific quality to it. It slows you down without corrupting you. It asks for patience, preparation, and humility. It does not demand that you become someone you don't respect. Learning to tell the difference requires discipline, because both types of resistance feel uncomfortable. The difference lies in what they cost you internally. Healthy resistance builds strength. Misaligned resistance extracts it. Long-term thinkers pay close attention to patterns instead of isolated events. One bad day is noise. Repeated friction in the same direction is a signal. When people ignore that signal, they often justify it by pointing to sunk costs. They say they've already invested too much time, effort, or reputation to change course. This is how misplaced focus locks people into diminishing returns. Instead of evaluating the future value of staying, they defend the past cost of starting. The result is loyalty to decisions that no longer serve them. Opportunity cost plays a quiet but decisive role here. Every hour spent forcing progress in the wrong direction is an hour not spent preparing for the right one. Every ounce of energy spent managing chaos is energy unavailable for building competence. Over years, this imbalance compounds. The person who repeatedly ignores resistance becomes skilled at surviving friction but not at creating leverage. They become resilient but not effective. Their discipline is spent enduring instead of advancing. There is also a subtle psychological consequence to fighting constant resistance. It trains the nervous system to normalize stress. You begin to associate progress with tension and success with anxiety. Calm starts to feel suspicious, as if ease means you're doing something wrong. This is why some people sabotage opportunities that feel aligned. They're unfamiliar with movement that doesn't hurt. Their identity has adapted to struggle rather than direction. The outcome is a cycle of self-created hardship that looks like ambition from the outside but feels like exhaustion from the inside. Clarity often arrives when you stop asking, "How do I push through this?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me about alignment?" That question shifts your focus from force to understanding. It doesn't remove responsibility, it refines it. You still work, you still prepare, you still sacrifice, but you invest where the return is structural, not just emotional. Think about the person who delays a major decision because the conditions keep demanding shortcuts. They don't rush to prove anything. They use the time to strengthen skills, stabilize finances, and refine judgment. The immediate outcome looks like delay. The long-term outcome is readiness. When the right opening appears, it doesn't feel frantic. It feels demanding but coherent. Their effort multiplies instead of dissipates because it meets less resistance at the structural level. Misplaced focus often comes from confusing difficulty with destiny. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it's important. And just because something feels blocked doesn't mean you lack discipline. Sometimes it means your discipline is being tested in a different way. The discipline to pause, reassess, and redirect. This kind of discipline is quieter and less visible, but it protects long-term outcomes far more effectively than stubborn persistence. Resistance, when interpreted correctly, sharpens judgment. It forces you to separate ego from intention. Ego wants to win now, prove something, and avoid looking uncertain. Intention wants sustainability, growth, and internal coherence. When ego leads, resistance feels insulting. When intention leads, resistance feels instructive. The difference shapes the entire trajectory of a life. People who learn to read resistance don't become passive. They become precise. They don't chase every opening. They wait for ones that can support their weight. They don't equate struggle with worth. They equate clarity with strength. Over time, this approach produces a calm confidence that doesn't rely on constant validation. They move slower in the beginning and much faster later because they're not dragging unresolved friction behind them. In a world that rewards visible effort, choosing to respect resistance looks counterintuitive. But the quiet truth is that the most costly mistakes are rarely made from lack of effort. They are made from effort applied in the wrong place for too long. When you learn to recognize resistance as guidance rather than an enemy, you stop exhausting yourself trying to prove you're strong enough to endure anything. Instead, you become disciplined enough to choose what's actually worth enduring. Patience is often misunderstood because most people measure effort by visible results. If nothing has changed on the surface, they assume nothing is happening underneath. That belief creates anxiety, and anxiety pushes people to interfere with processes that were never meant to be rushed. The truth is, impatience is rarely about time itself. It is about insecurity. It is about the fear that if results are not immediate, they may never arrive, or worse, that they will arrive for someone else instead. This fear quietly turns patience into a performance rather than a discipline. Real patience is not passive waiting. It is active preparation without emotional attachment to outcome. It is choosing to show up, improve, and stay consistent even when there is no immediate feedback loop. Most people struggle here because the human brain is wired to seek quick rewards. When effort is not instantly reinforced, motivation drops. That is why people abandon long-term plans for short-term relief. The choice feels rational in the moment because it reduces discomfort. The trade-off is invisible at first but severe over time: shallow growth, unstable confidence, and a pattern of starting over. Look closely at how this plays out in daily behavior. Someone begins working toward a meaningful goal, learning a skill, building a business, improving their health. At first, progress is slow and unglamorous. The work feels repetitive. No one is applauding. Doubt enters. At this stage, impatience whispers that maybe the goal is unrealistic, or that there must be a faster route. If they listen, they pivot too early. The immediate outcome is relief from uncertainty. The long-term outcome is stagnation disguised as flexibility. They never stay long enough in one direction to compound results. Patience requires the discipline to tolerate being unimpressive for longer than your ego prefers. That tolerance is rare because modern culture rewards visibility, not depth. People want proof that their effort matters, preferably in public and preferably now. But most valuable outcomes are built privately, through small decisions repeated without drama. When patience is present, focus sharpens. You stop asking whether the effort is being noticed and start asking whether it is improving you. That shift changes the quality of your work because it removes desperation from the process. Attachment to outcome is what corrupts patience. When you tie your self-worth to a specific result, every delay feels personal. You interpret neutral events as signs of failure. This emotional noise distorts judgment. You overcorrect. You compare timelines. You chase signals instead of systems. The choice to obsess over outcomes steals attention from inputs. The trade-off is predictability. You become reactive instead of deliberate. Over time, this reactivity leads to uneven results and emotional fatigue. Consider someone investing time into developing expertise. If they are attached to recognition, they rush to display competence before it is fully formed. The immediate outcome might be praise or opportunity. The long-term outcome is exposure of gaps they were not ready to handle. Confidence takes a hit. Compare that to someone who remains patient, refining their craft without urgency. They may appear slower initially, but when responsibility comes, they are prepared. Their competence is quiet but durable. This is the compounding effect of patience applied consistently. Patience also clarifies opportunity cost. When you are not obsessed with immediate results, you become more selective with your energy. You stop scattering effort across multiple directions just to feel productive. Divided priorities feel efficient in the short term because something is always happening. In reality, they dilute progress. Each additional commitment taxes focus, increases cognitive load, and slows learning. Patience allows you to accept fewer opportunities in exchange for deeper mastery. That trade-off feels uncomfortable early and invaluable later. There is an emotional maturity required to work without guarantees. It means accepting that progress is often asymmetrical. Long periods of apparent stagnation are followed by sudden breakthroughs that look effortless from the outside. People who lack patience quit during the flat phases because they mistake silence for failure. Those who understand process recognize that growth often happens below the surface first. Skills consolidate, judgment sharpens, habits stabilize. None of this is visible, but all of it is necessary. Misplaced focus shows up when impatience drives people to measure themselves against others instead of against their own trajectory. Comparison accelerates dissatisfaction because it ignores context. You don't see the years of preparation behind someone else's result. You only see the outcome and assume delay means deficiency. This mental shortcut leads to poor decisions. People abandon sound plans to imitate faster ones that don't fit their circumstances. The short-term outcome is renewed hope. The long-term outcome is misalignment and wasted effort. Patience also protects against emotional overinvestment. When you are not attached to